Thank you and good morning. So I want to kind of move a little bit out of the usual e-government conversations where we talk about architectures and procurement rules and specific approaches to technology, although I'll get to all of that, and look at the big picture. 2 words about me. I'm from a think tank in Brussels called the Lisbon Council, but before then I worked for the Estonian government for 8 years in Brussels and of course in Tallinn. And so I'll try and bring both of those viewpoints. And this discussion today is part of a broader reflection that we have that we're calling DSM 2.0, which is about the future of Europe's digital agenda. And we're going to have European elections in a year. And that means that in Brussels, everyone's thinking about what do the next 10 years look like for the European budget, for legislation, for Europe's role in technology compared to the rest of the world. So this is a sort of a standard ranking of how Europe is doing in digitization across a bunch of different things. And a couple of things stand out. The first is that Europe has some real world leaders. So the top 4, which I think are Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, they're among the very best in the world. The EU average is sort of somewhere in the middle. You know, the US as a whole is a bit ahead of us. But the bottom 4 aren't doing terribly great, sandwiched right after Russia and Serbia. So the point is there are big gaps within how Europe is doing on digitization, and there's a lot of catch-up to do. And so sometimes it feels with the digital single market that we've been building for the last 5 years, that we're building this big, impressive construct, and we're more or less on the way to being there. We know what the plan is, we know what we need to do. But other times it feels like we're still at the beginning of this construction process and we haven't even laid the basic foundations. And I think that this picture is more correct than this picture. Because if we look at the nature of the digital revolution, then we're really only getting started. So the details aren't so important here. This is a graph of level of digital intensity in a bunch of different sectors. And what you see is a couple of sectors, travel agencies, tour operators, telecommunications are very digitized, but many others aren't. Transport, still a long way to go. Administrative support, which includes the back office for any kind of company, a long way to go. Many manufacturing subsectors, a whole lot of work to do on digitization. This is another slide. It's basically the same idea. This one's done by the European Commission. This one's done by McKinsey. They say the same thing. What they basically say is we are still at the beginning of the digital revolution. And in particular, they also say that government is one of those areas that still has a lot of work to do. So government itself here, one of the less digitized areas, but also sectors that are highly regulated by the government, that are public services like healthcare, education, they still have a lot of work to do. And so a little bit of self-promotion. We're engaged in this discussion process. We also put out a paper this week proposing a digital agenda for the next commission. I encourage you to go to our website and read it. And I'm going to try and relate some of those topics today to the more particular question of government and public administration. And if we look at a global ranking of digital public services, Europeans like to tell themselves, well, we're behind on digital, but at least when it comes to e-government, we have some of the best in the world. And again, that's kind of true. We do have some of the best in the world. Estonia is here. But the EU average is actually lower than the EU average in overall digitization. And the bottom 4 in the EU, and I can tell you Slovakia is not one of the bottom 4, but the bottom 4 in the EU are doing worse than pretty much every other major economy in the world. So even on digital public services, we have a lot of work to do. And part of the picture is that if you're an e-government person in the public sector, your life is pretty damn hard. It feels like this kind of a traffic jam. You have a million things to worry about. On the one hand, you have to keep the day-to-day operations going. You've got to worry about the uptime of your servers. You've got to worry about whether your ecosystem's working. You have messy procurements to handle. And at the same time, you probably have the Prime Minister's office and the journalists who want to talk to you about AI and blockchain. How the hell do you figure it out and prioritize it? Well, I would suggest to you that part of the problem is that public sector IT looks a bit like this. It's tinkering in a mechanics workshop. It's trying to fix an old timer with a lot of legacy. And we've thought about different ways of trying to fix that. One of those is reuse. Go take someone else's solution, try and apply that in your systems. But that's not perfect. Reuse means you might get something with bad documentation or something with documentation in another language. It doesn't have support attached to it. It might not work with all your standards. And the really big gulf is between how this works and how IT in the private sector has come to work, which looks a lot more like this. a standardized warehouse, a whole lot of off-the-shelf components, a stack that is pretty flexible, that's available no longer as much as something you procure as a service. And so the challenge in a way for government, and this is what I think some of the cloud providers will talk about on the day-to-day level of how to actually provide good e-government and how to provide effective government, is how we go from this to this. And the costs of not doing it are clear. These smartphones, I mean, we had smartphones in 2007. Let me ask you, how many of your e-government services today are optimized for a mobile environment? Probably not very many, and 3 or 4 years ago, probably none. That's not a one-time problem. It's not, oh, the mobile revolution happened and we missed it because government was a bit slow. No, this is a fundamental problem in how we do IT. If you renew your system every 10 years and you update your website every 10 years and your user interface every 10 years, you're going to miss this. And you're going to be 10 years behind when people, and people today are ordering stuff using Siri and Amazon Alexa and using that to interact with the internet. Who here has a voice-activated AI agent for e-government services? Anyone? Hands up? No. Not even Estonia has that yet. But that's where the private sector is. Does anyone know what this is? I know some people here who should know what this is. This is a quantum computer. This is going to wreck all of your EIDs, all of your PKI in a few years. The worries you had last year, that Estonia had last year on the PKI being a little uncertified and a little unsecure, that's a small deal. This is going to make all of your e-signatures useless. It's going to break public key cryptography in maybe 10 years, maybe 5. What are you going to do then? And is every European country going to figure that out itself? I don't know. But this is, these are just 2 examples of where, frankly, government has not caught up and been able to keep up with what the private sector is doing in IT. Again, the details of this slide aren't so important, but it shows some of the cost differences between doing your own IT versus using a cloud service. The problem is, and what this slide tells you is that there are more regular running costs to cloud, but actually fewer costs in the long run because of all the stuff that's kind of below the waterline, hardware, personnel, maintenance. The problem is this isn't reflected in how we do procurement. Procurement processes, as they work today, they prefer capital expenditure over operational expenditure. And that's particularly true if you use structural funds. Has anyone ever tried to go and say, I would like the EU to pay €1 million a year for me to run this service? Pfft, good luck. Of course, if you go and say, I'd like 10 million euros to build this really fancy system and then I'll do a big procurement, no problem. Shovel structural funds money at you. That's true outside of EU funds too. That's a problem with government in general. They make it easier to spend money on capital than operational expenditure. So the first point I want to say is just to look at this. The thing I want to suggest to you is that if public sector IT were run a little bit more like how, not all of the private sector, but the best of the private sector runs its IT, we'd be doing a better job. We'd also be doing a better job at this traffic management situation because, okay, now I've gone ahead of myself, because frankly you'd have fewer things to worry about. And so there's a hard question for government to ask themselves, which is, are they doing too much? Could they be leaving more to the private sector, not just in terms of procurement, but actually pushing out and using the stack that the market provides? The second issue is local government. It's not so bad in a smaller country, but go to a complex federal structure, good luck. It's a mess. And so we need to find a way to deal with the interoperability and the security issues of local government, but also to use the resources they have and the services they provide. And I want to highlight one positive case here, which is Germany. Germany went and changed their constitution to give the central government the authority to set interoperability and security requirements for the lender and for local government. And they, Germany, the lender versus the center, it's even, it's as bad as it is in Austria. It's a mess. They changed their constitution to do e-government better. Now, if Germany can do that with their messy political process, I don't think anyone has an excuse for not figuring out how to make interoperability between national and local governments work. And the last bit I want to talk about as a result of all this is, how should you think about your job as a government CIO, the head of an IT agency? And what I want to suggest is that the metaphor we probably want to use is something akin to forestry or ecosystem management. Sometimes you need to build something yourself. Sometimes you need to plant something. Sometimes you need to cut down some weeds so that other types of trees can grow. Doesn't mean you have to be responsible for everything yourself. This is a former president of Estonia cutting brush, by the way. So we really like our ecosystem management in Estonia. Everyone gets involved. But that ecosystem management, and this is where we talked about the broader effect of public administration on digitization, that ecosystem management isn't just about the core task of public services. It's also about the areas that might be provided by the private sector, but where government has a strong role. I'll give you an example. This is a health monitor that is gathering an incredible amount of data about my health. It's got my heart rate, it has my pulse, it's got all sorts of things about my health. The question is, does the data here interoperate with my e-health records? Not today, but shouldn't it? Shouldn't Apple and the hospital be using similar data formats and be able to share, import the data from an Apple device? Or transport's another example. Uber, public transport companies, they're all sitting on amazing amounts of data. They can't just put them together amongst themselves because of competitive issues, but actually government as an orchestrator of this ecosystem can bring them to the table and use the data they have on traffic flows to build a better public transportation system that's cheaper and greener. And you can continue with these examples. I want to really go ahead and provoke you with this one. We still provide our own hardware for EID. At the same time, Google, really secure two-factor, probably more secure than most of the two-factor that's provided by governments. Face ID, after they worked out some kinks, it's A, secure, it's B, really easy to use. Now the thing is, these have a user base of, in Google's case, over 1 billion in terms of Face ID, I don't know, hundreds of millions. So why the hell are we still providing our own EIDs? Now, I'm not saying we should just go and replace our national EIDs with Google and Apple. There are some real problems there around privacy, around market control, but we should be asking ourselves, what are the obstacles? Because we could make our lives easier, save money, and probably do a better job at providing public services if we thought of ourselves not as providing the IT, but orchestrating an ecosystem and providing the public good of a secure EID that gets us to this outcome. And that frees up time to actually focus on doing what we need to do as government, which is using data to make good policy. Figuring out the right types of open APIs so that people can build services on top of our central stack. Or dealing with big public missions. And I have this particular slide, and I'm almost done, because I see the organizers looking nervously at me. Last week, the EPP, the European People's Party, which is the grouping of conservative European parties, but it's the biggest party grouping in the European Parliament, held their Congress. And they selected their candidate to be president of the next European Commission. And the other parties are now doing the same thing. And in his speech, he talked about migration, the guy who won, Manfred Weber. He talked about migration, he talked about security. But one of the 4 things he said was, we need to set big goals in Europe. And he spoke specifically about eliminating cancer. And he said, with all the money we have, with all the researchers we have, and with all the data we have in Europe, why don't we take eliminating cancer as a goal for the next 5 or 10 years? And I think the important point here is it's not just an e-government project, right? This requires a much broader range of people, but e-government, health records management is a key part of this. And so I think what you'll see is that the politicians are learning enough about how the digital revolution works that they don't just want nice IT systems, they actually want to think about how you can change the basic business logic of government. And the cost of not doing it is that the crisis of legitimacy that our government has gets worse and worse. This is the Winter Palace being stormed either in October or November, depending on your calendar, of 1917. And what I know for sure is I don't want Europe to end up like this again. And with that, thank you.